August 6, 1945. This Sunday marks 72 years since the first use of nuclear weapons on civilians in the history of the world. After years of research on the controversial multi-billion-dollar Manhattan Project, President Harry S. Truman approved these deadly, unpredictable weapons to be used on the city of Hiroshima, Japan. In Truman's diary, he wrote the following, and I apologize for his language. I have told the Secretary of War to use it so that military objectives and soldiers and sailors are the target, and not women or children. Even if the Japs are savage, ruthless, merciless, and fanatic, the target will be a purely military one. So we'll see about that. When the smoke cleared, more than 100,000 civilians were killed, plus about 20,000 more in military personnel. Keep in mind, it's almost impossible to exactly track the casualties after an explosion like that. These are rough estimates. 30% of the population of Hiroshima erased. 69% of the buildings obliterated. To make it worse, 90% of doctors and 93% of nurses were killed as well. A flagrant war crime and a crime against humanity. Truman bragged that the U.S. and allies had spent $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history and won. He warned the Japanese that without an unconditional surrender, there would be more ruin to come. Only 3 days after Hiroshima, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, Japan. This would be the last atomic bomb ever used in war since. By the end of 1945, at least 80,000 people were killed in the second attack. Only 3 days later, the Imperial government of Japan announced its surrender. Emperor Hirohito said, quote, "Should we continue to fight, not only would it result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also would lead to the total extinction of human civilization." Altogether, 200,000 people died in these two explosions. A study of patients between 1950 and 2000 showed that 46% of leukemia cases developed as a result of these attacks. Japan was left with deep scars, both physical and mental. But what could have pushed the U.S. to commit such a barbaric act without any idea of how it would affect the people attacked? Here in the U.S. education system, there's about two answers you'll get. Just raise a hand if you've heard these before. Either A, the atomic bombs were fair revenge for the attacks at Pearl Harbor, the never forget crowd. Or B, something about how there was no other way to end the war without millions of deaths. These lines are so commonly used by school teachers, parents, politicians, and pundits that they've almost become unquestionable. Like in the same way, socialism is unquestionably evil. Challenging these ideas is akin to treason, denying us of the glorious end-of-war story that makes World War II America's good war. Well, reevaluating those notions is exactly what we're going to do right now. As a bit of forewarning, critiquing the U.S. for the atomic strikes doesn't mean Japan was completely innocent. It was an empire like any other, committing some of the most horrible acts of the 20th century. Atrocities like the invasion of Manchuria, the Imperial War against Chinese nationalists and communists, the massacre at Nanking, and the taking of comfort women as sex slaves should never be ignored. But starting with the first argument, that the atomic bombings were justified because of the completely unprovoked attacks on Pearl Harbor in December 1942. But the unprovoked part of that is the part that needs to be examined. In fact, the U.S. had been involved long before Pearl Harbor. The U.S. intervened with heavy embargoes on goods like coal and iron to Japan. They disrupted their war plans since empires needed a constant supply of raw materials, as they do today. In response, Japan signed a defensive pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Next, Japan took over Indochina, modern-day Vietnam. This time, FDR helped to create an embargo which blocked all exports to Japan. In desperate need of oil, Japan had the idea of invading the Dutch East Indies, but they knew that this move would anger the U.S. So to prevent that, they attacked Pearl Harbor in order to weaken the Americans before they could attack. Nearly 2,500 Americans, mostly military, were killed in the attacks. With that little history lesson out of the way, the main point is that the idea that Pearl Harbor was unprovoked is pure fantasy. The idea that the loss of life was anywhere near that of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, a fiction. Instead of the typical lines from our history books, the truth is a little more calculated. The U.S. made their decisions based on imperial interests, hitting back once the Japanese started cutting into those interests. While many Americans saw the atomic bombings as their long overdue revenge, to call it a massive overkill would be an understatement. On to the second argument, that it was the only way to end the war without millions of deaths because of the, to quote Truman, fanatic nature of the Japanese. They wouldn't surrender any other way, right? Well, the Japanese didn't want an unconditional surrender. They wanted to keep their old government in their colonies, but it's worth noting that their Supreme Council was meeting to discuss the terms of surrender before the bombing of Nagasaki. Because of the US's air raids, at least 68 cities in Japan were in ruins. The firebombing of Tokyo claimed 120,000 lives by itself. But if they were going to surrender, why use atomic bombs at all? Something they always leave out is that the Soviet Union, after years of neutrality, finally declared war on Japan that same August. They liberated Manchuria from the Japanese occupation before handing it to the Chinese communists, defeating Japan's largest fighting force, the Kwantung Army. They set their sights on an invasion of Japan. So, faced with an invasion from both sides by the world's two greatest powers, Japan finally surrendered. The decision to use the bomb was more of a game of public perception. The United States wanted to assert both to the Soviet Union and the world that it was the strongest military power on Earth, and that nations needed to follow its post-war leadership or face the consequences. For Japan, the atomic bombs were a convenient way for Emperor Hirohito to hide his army's military blunders by blaming it on a completely new technology. It was a way to give die-hard military fanatics a reason to end the war and still retain his honor despite defeat. For the US, the bomb showed their awesome military might on a world stage and helped draw attention away from Soviet, Chinese, Korean, or other anti-colonial contributions to the fight against Japanese imperialism. Now, according to the American myth, the US had won the war against Germany and Japan. Soon after World War II, the US started militarizing against communism directly. The Truman Doctrine laid out a policy of containment to keep communism from spreading. In Korea, the US suppressed the pro-communist People's Republic of Korea, which included both halves of the peninsula. In 1950, the US gave military support to their puppet regime in South Korea after the North pushed to reunite the two. In the Philippines, another former Japanese colony, the US helped local elites by suppressing the communist hucks and eventually bringing the dictator Ferdinand Marcos into power after a leftist party was elected. The war against communism was global within a few years of World War II. Sovereignty came second to containment. It's no stretch of the imagination to conclude that the use of the atomic bomb was a diplomatic tool for promoting the American capitalist worldview. Their involvement in the war only prolonged the anti-colonial struggle instead of truly bringing liberation. Speaking of liberation, the anti-colonial struggle, and the theme of Black August today, something that needs to be reiterated is the involvement of black soldiers in the war. Of course, black women and men who joined the forces were given inferior, segregated living quarters, training, and even rations. 125,000 black soldiers fought in every theater of the war, only to be treated as second-class citizens on the fronts and at home. The military wouldn't be desegregated until 1948, but black soldiers had proven their prowess long before that. There were 1,700 black soldiers at D-Day, including the 327th Quartermaster Service Company and the 320th Anti-Aircraft Barrage Balloon Battalion, which protected the soldiers landing on the beach. The 761st Tank Battalion was vital to repelling Nazis from 30 major cities in France, Belgium, and Germany. The famed Tuskegee Airmen and their red-tailed planes were known for their excellent work escorting bombers in southern Italy. The black contributions to the war, whether in combat, support, or anything in between, were vital and undeniable. Their dedication to liberation overseas, despite discrimination thrown against them, only helped to plant the seeds that would grow into the civil rights movement in the next decade. As we reflect on the history of nuclear weapons, it's important to realize that whenever you hear a politician or a TV commentator make a joke or a careless remark about nuking this or that country, that person never had to witness the brutal consequences of atomic weapons. The only people who can attest to their awesome strength have mostly perished now, and I think Ted Cruz is about the last person I expect to comprehend the horrors that those bombs leave behind. Nuclear weapons have only become stronger and stronger, more and more plentiful since 1945, so the scale of destruction would be dramatically higher if used today. The irony is that the US tries to dictate which leaders are competent and trustworthy enough to have nukes when they remain, to date, the only power to ever use them in war. Does it make any sense for the US to pressure nations like North Korea to surrender their nuclear stockpiles to the US after seeing the hell that US rained on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? After the US dropped more bombs on Korea in the Korean War than were dropped by either side of the World War II European theater. After seeing firsthand the destruction dealt to Iraq, Syria, Libya, and other nations in the 21st century. I can't answer those questions for you, but maybe the rogue nations aren't the small ones who want to resist US hegemony, but the one nation in history to use them in war. Perhaps any genuine calls for denuclearization should start with the nation who has almost 7,000 nuclear weapons that could be aimed at any inch of the planet. But evidently, the US empire's goal isn't denuclearization, but world domination. On this 72nd anniversary of the world's only nuclear attacks, it's my sincere hope that no nation ever has to use these despicable weapons again. But history shows us time and time again that a capitalist empire will stop at nothing to fulfill its infinite hunger. A peaceful, non-nuclear world is within imagination, but only if there's a massive shift toward respecting sovereignty, fighting for liberation, and ending the 70-year push for US hegemony. That's all.